Hey everyone, welcome back to another hardware news recap for the week. In this one, we're talking about NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel potentially backing out of Computex, along with several of the case makers we've spoken with. AMD doubling down and simultaneously doubling back on its open source promises for GPUOpen. Samsung pushing a 6.5 gigabyte per second sequential read SSD to market. The US wanting to bring chip makers stateside for additional production. Unpatchable, Thunderspy, attack vectors, and plenty more, including Unreal Engine 5. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's Conductonaut liquid metal. Conductonaut is what we've used in all of our liquid metal and delid thermal tests, capable of dropping CPU thermals significantly when replacing the stock thermal interface. Lower CPU thermals don't just allow better overclocks, but also lower noise levels because the transfer efficiency is increased. The mix of gallium and indium makes for a thermal conductivity of 73 watts per meter Kelvin, outclassing traditional pastes significantly. Learn more at the link in the description below. So I want to start off with the GN news item first. This is our new mouse mat. You all have been asking us to make a mouse mat for a long time now. We didn't want to just print a logo on it. We wanted to do a whole custom design for it and also a whole custom mouse mat. So we even did blue rubber for the backside, which was exceptionally hard to do. You have no idea how hard it was just to make the rubber blue. It's apparently really uncommon, which increased our minimum order quantity by a lot and also increased our cost, but we didn't increase MSRP with it because I just really wanted blue rubber, personally, for the back of the mat. So the new GamersNexus wireframe mouse mat is about 36 inches by 12 inches. We'll put the centimeters up on the screen if you want that instead, and it's already on store.gamersnexus.net if you want to pick it up. We had to individually source the supply of all the materials and really get it right. This took 10 months of back and forth sampling. You'd think a mouse pad would be easy, and it would be if you just kind of printed a logo on it and called it a day, but we did a lot of back and forth sampling because we wanted to specifically work with a factory and a printer that had a really high print quality for fine details, because if you look closely at the mouse mat, it's got all these wireframe components that Andrew made in Blunder actually for this project. So they're 3D models that we were able to rotate and put on the mat for things like CPU coolers. There's a tower cooler there with all the fin stack and copper heat pipe components you'd get just like in a real one. There's a liquid cooler that has a cold plate visible in it. We have orange accents for the tubes and the tank on the radiator. SSD with small components, motherboard with small components. There's a video card with a complete VRM on it. You probably wouldn't be able to actually boot that thing, but there's a VRM on it. Memory modules and the GN wireframe logo. So there's a lot of really small detail in there, and we just announced this in a separate video. It's on the store now, on store.gamersnexus.net, and it is shipping now. So this is already in stock and going out as soon as the orders come in. So yeah, biggest considerations for us were fine detail printing quality, which meant choosing between a few different factories, doing a lot of sample runs and rejecting all the bad ones till we got to where we are today, to with high quality print. We did the blue stitching on the border to reduce fraying and increase the longevity of the mat. And then the blue rubber on the back was just because I really wanted to do something unique, and it's just kind of a flair to add to it, and you're not paying any extra for it. It was just because I wanted to do it. So this whole thing was a big undertaking, and the surface is microfiber surface, so it's the same surface as our other mouse pads. If you've used those, they glide really well. But the biggest thing that I worked on logistically was getting rid of single-use plastics, and it was a lot harder than I thought. So we work with a lot of computer hardware, obviously, every single day, and one of the things that just personally bothers me is opening up a cooler and finding 12 plastic bags in it to contain a few sets of screws. And there's a lot of good reasons that manufacturers use so much single-use plastic. It's because they're worried about things scratching each other, and now you have an RMA over scratched paint, and now you're throwing away the entire product rather than just a plastic bag. So it's a difficult balance to strike. The reason that mouse pads use single-use plastics when shipping typically is to protect because they often flat pack them, so you end up with rubber to microfiber cloth, and you can have some of the rubber rub off on the cloth, and the best solution to that typically is single-use plastic, but I really wanted to get rid of it, so we worked with the factory to get a solution in place where there's no plastic involved, and the way it ships to you is basically the way it ships to us, except it's palletized for us and packed, efficiently, so we can fit a lot of them on a pallet. But we did get rid of plastic, so I'm really actually proud of that, and that was, it cost a little bit more too. You wouldn't think it would because you're removing a component from the chain, but that component, plastic, is so common that in some instances you can end up paying more because now you're adding potentially like a process to roll the mats, for example, to protect them a certain way without using materials, and that costs manpower, which in a lot of places will cost more than the plastic will, because that's the way the world works. So yeah, that's on the store. It's one of the best ways to support us is by buying our products on the store, because it helps us reduce our reliance on advertisers, and it allows me to continue to be extremely picky about ads and not sell ads for things like, for example, the A500 that didn't perform well, because we're supported by the community with our store purchases. So thanks for letting me talk about that. Let's move on to the news for the week. The first one, Computex is in rough shape for the computer hardware industry. There's already been a dialing back of Computex back when it was postponed from May, June-ish timeline to the September timeline. They already announced that they were decreasing the exhibit floor space. It's typically the entirety of Nangang Convention Center and also Taiwan World Trade Center, and then also some of Taipei 101. That's been constricted significantly with the move to September. And also the computer hardware manufacturers are falling off one by one. So to our knowledge, Cooler Master is not presently planning to go. And to our knowledge, several of the video card board partners are not planning to go. Not going to name them yet, not sure if we really can, but suffice to say, we've had a lot of conversations with people when we were trying to figure out if we're flying to Computex or not this year, and it looks like the answer is probably no. Intel, NVIDIA, and AMD are now in the list of rumored companies dropping out of Computex. The cancellations are due to, of course, none other than our recurring enemy, human malware, and it looks like it's getting pared down pretty hard. For now, according to Digitimes, the sources show that it looks like Gigabyte and MSI are likely to bail on the show. We can actually confirm this. We've heard that as well. AMD has been promising Zen 3 and RDNA 2 for 2020 for some time now, and it's been expected that, at least for CPUs, AMD would take the wraps off at Computex this year, but it's uncertain at this point whether that's going to happen. If AMD and other chip makers are indeed going to be absent from this year's show, we'd expect them to pivot to an online event, such as a live stream, like NVIDIA just did for GTC 2020. Digitimes report notes that other vendors and OEMs are already planning such online events to show off their products that were slated for Computex 2020. And speaking from our own experience, that's probably going to include Cooler Master, and it might include Lian Li and a couple of the other case makers. So these are companies that are based in Taiwan. So if they're not going to Computex 5 minutes down the road, that's not a good sign for Computex. And that's a big show for the industry. It's an important one. Even if you don't watch the coverage, that's where everything starts to kind of get rolling for the next year. AMD goes back on open source promises, and the story after this will be about AMD doubling down on open source promises. So we've got two conflicting narratives for this one. AMD's Scott Herkelman posted on Reddit recently about Epic's Unreal Engine advancements, which will be in this same news show later on. And in so doing, Herkelman noted the following, quote, "What is exciting about the new consoles launching is that for those game developers who build games across PC and consoles, it will push them to incorporate leading next-gen techniques to all audiences. The other point that we here at AMD have been planning for is the timing with the console launches, to ensure that no hardware vendor-specific proprietary ray tracing technique or other GPU features slows down and bifurcates the industry to adopting next-gen features. With this console momentum and Microsoft's DXR for PCs, I'm hopeful," Scott Herkelman said, "that we can push towards an open ecosystem for all gaming and gamers." Shortly after recommitting to openness for its GPU and graphics solutions, AMD shattered another one of its glass walls after years of casting stones through it at competitors, including NVIDIA and Intel. And it did so because there's been a change to GPUOpen and the ray tracing solution that's hosted on it. There may be a legitimate reason for this licensing change, and it could be a reason that's related to the console makers, but once you're tossing stones at competitors, it sort of stops mattering just how legitimate the reasons are. It's hard to forget the interminable nagging of NVIDIA by AMD for years for NVIDIA's closed source graphics solutions. And AMD's Radeon Rays solution, hosted on AMD's GPUOpen website, has now gone to closed source after specifically calling for non-proprietary graphics standards within days of that happening. And also, the GPUOpen site is entirely dedicated to that principle. So changes that were made to Radeon Rays version 4.0 include dropping OpenCL, dropping open source, adding DirectX 12, adding Vulkan, adding optimization for bounding volume hierarchies or BVHs, and a couple of other changes. The licensing moved from the MIT open source license to just a simple closed source license, and it looks like GPUOpen is remaining as the host for Radeon Rays 4.0 despite this change. We should note a few key things here. First off, we don't begrudge any company for having closed source code, especially if it's a GPU maker. They're typically extremely competitive. It makes sense that they wouldn't want to optimize for each other's code, and if AMD wants to go down that path, that's certainly fine. We won't hold it against them. It's also potentially millions of dollars investment, if not more. Could be hundreds of millions in some cases, and not every single software package needs to be given away for free. Again, especially in a competitive market. So if AMD wants to go closed source, cool. But the problem is that AMD has built its brand now on top of smearing its competitors for doing the things that it's starting to do. You see this with the chipset situation and the socket situation. Now AMD technically is sticking to socket support through 2020, even though it later rephrased that to till 2020. It's sticking to it. But Intel has had socket support since 2015 for LGA 1151. The difference is that AMD implicitly made it seem like the other chipsets would continue to be supported with all versions of Zen. Anyway, that's old news. You've all heard about it by now. So now we're seeing similar things on the GPU side. And if AMD wants to do these things, that's completely fine. But it needs to watch out for its marketing so that this doesn't happen and it comes back and bites it for being a hypocrite rather than just being like every other company, in which case it's like, well, they're all doing it, so whatever. Quick update. After filming that story and several hours after about a day after we asked for a comment from AMD, we did eventually receive a comment to GamersNexus from AMD, and it says, quote, "Thank you to the community for the feedback on Radeon Rays 4.0. We have reviewed this internally and will be making the following changes. AMD will make Radeon Rays 4.0 open source. However, specific AMD IP will be placed into libraries and have source code available for the community via SLA." At this point, as for what those specific IPs are, they're almost certainly related to AMD's partners, so potentially Xbox and the PlayStation 5. But it sounds like AMD realized the irony of exactly what we were saying in the first half of this and has gone back on it. We downloaded the Radeon Rays package. It does look like it has most of the normal open source language in it, so they have reverted to that. And one of the developers from AMD on the Radeon Rays GitHub page, going by the name of Dimitri, posted this comment as well. "Hi guys, thanks for still being with us and for the feedback you've provided so far. It has been decided yesterday to open source most of Radeon Rays 4 and put AMD specific IP in closed source modules. Source will be available upon request under SLA." So glad to see that AMD is at least starting to identify the irony in some of its marketing and its actions, because this is a good change at least overall. All of that stated, AMD does get credit for breathing new life into the rest of its open source GPUOpen suite, both with a revamped website and a collection of new technologies optimized for RDNA-based GPUs. GPUOpen was launched in 2016 as an open source alternative to NVIDIA's GameWorks, but AMD is overhauling it for developers with 4 new FidelityFX effects. As AMD notes, the FidelityFX family was announced last year with its open source effect, Contrast Adaptive Sharpening, or CAS. That made its way to games like Rage 2 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now, FidelityFX has been expanded to include Stochastic Screen Space Reflections, or SSSR, Combined Adaptive Compute Ambient Occlusion, or what we're calling Cacao, Luminance Preserving Mapper, or LPM, and Single Pass Downsampler, or SPD. Stochastic Screen Space Reflections is AMD's take on Screen Space Reflections, or SSR, which is an old approach to cost-saving graphics that reduce GPU load by only calculating reflections based on the view frustum. Specifically, the FidelityFX implementation will look to shore up shortcomings with traditional screen space reflections, of which there are many, with a different algorithm that can add varying degrees of roughness to support glossy or less glossy surfaces. SSSR also comes with an RDNA-optimized denoiser, combining results from several frames to construct a noise-free image. Next is FidelityFX Cacao, or Combined Adaptive Compute Ambient Occlusion. This is an RDNA optimized version of ambient occlusion. Cacao, based on Intel's adaptive screen space ambient occlusion, has been optimized to support a range of hardware and sampling quality options. And we really hope that Cacao becomes the official name that all of the other media use when talking about this. FidelityFX Luminance Preserving Mapper, or LPM, was the other one announced. This is an open source library for bringing over HDR and wide gamut tone and mapping into games. There's also support for packed FP16 when using Vulkan. Lastly, there's FidelityFX Single Pass Downsampler, or SPD. This can be used for downsampling the resolution of assets using MIP levels. SPD is capable of a single pass for all MIP levels rather than a pass for every MIP level, meaning the GPU doesn't have to be synchronized after each step. This makes SPD suitable for asynchronous compute and should speed up performance. That's as easy as it needs to be, AMD. Just do this. Just announce the good things and stop throwing rocks at people, because this is all good news on its own. You don't need to try and tear people down in the process of this. The US wants to bring chip makers stateside for production. Intel already has several fabs in the US, but it looks like the current administration is in talks with Intel and TSMC about bolstering the chip manufacturing capabilities of US-based factories. The talks between the US government and chip makers come as, obviously, the global geopolitics heat up with China, especially between the US and China, and that's thanks to hot seat issues such as trade and human malware, as it is now. The US government has become increasingly concerned about reliance on chip manufacturing and supply chains in China. To that end, representatives with Intel and TSMC have been in contact with the Department of Defense about increasing domestic chip production, according to Reuters. Quote, Intel is well positioned to work with the US government to operate a US-owned commercial foundry and supply a broad range of secure microelectronics, said Intel. In unrelated news, Intel has posted 28 security advisories since January of 2020. But anyway, that just seemed appropriate to say, but we'll move on. TSMC has continued to straddle the fence on this proposal by the government, and it notes that it is, quote, actively evaluating all suitable locations, including the US, as an option for its new fabs, and it says there is no concrete plan yet. Furthermore, according to a separate report from Digitimes, the prophets of the industry, TSMC continues to weigh in on options for locations outside of Taiwan, and it does say that the US is one such possible location. TSMC also stated that if it were to move any manufacturing capacity to the US at all, it would be spurred by consumer demand. However, new reports have seemingly contradicted what Digitimes was saying. According to the Wall Street Journal, TSMC has imminent plans to build a 5nm foundry in Arizona, with construction expected to begin in 2021. TSMC expects production to begin in 2024. The new fab would get a $12 billion investment spread over 9 years, and it would create an estimated 1,600 jobs. The fab will eventually be capable of producing 20,000 wafers per month. This will mark TSMC's second manufacturing site in the US, with the other being located in Washington. TSMC also holds design centers in Austin, Texas, and San Jose, California. The US government is also apparently looking into ways to help Samsung expanding its facilities in the US. Samsung currently has a plant in Austin, Texas. Speaking of security vulnerabilities and how secure the microelectronics Intel makes can be, news has surfaced of a new hardware-based exploit affecting Thunderbolt ports, aptly named Thunderspy. The news comes to light thanks to the work of researcher Bjorn Reutenberg, and the exploit affects any PC with a Thunderbolt port and can apparently bypass passwords and encryption to capture data. While the attack is serious, it should be noted that this attack requires the attacker to have physical access to the hardware, which should theoretically limit the attack surface. Thunderspy is a collection of attacks that essentially break any security measures put in place by Thunderbolt 1, 2, and 3 and allow DMA attacks, or direct memory access. Quote, these vulnerabilities lead to 9 practical exploitation scenarios. In an evil-made threat level model and varying security levels, we demonstrate the ability to create arbitrary Thunderbolt device identities, clone user-authorized Thunderbolt devices, and finally, obtain PCIe connectivity to perform DMA attacks. In addition, we show unauthenticated overriding of security-level configurations, including the ability to disable Thunderbolt security entirely, and restoring Thunderbolt connectivity if the system is restricted to exclusively passing through USB and/or DisplayPort. We conclude with demonstrating the ability to permanently disable Thunderbolt security and block all future firmware updates, says Reutenberg in his report. As for the affected devices, Thunderspy affects all PCs that were made between 2011 and 2019, shipping with Thunderbolt, obviously, and it's essentially unpatchable via software or via firmware mitigations. According to the researcher, it will require a silicon redesign. Intel notes via a blog post that kernel direct memory access, or DMA again, has been in place since 2019 to mitigate Thunderbolt-based attacks. However, the research paper warns that kernel direct memory access protection isn't a silver bullet for Thunderspy, and that Thunderspy stands to threaten future connection standards such as USB 4 and Thunderbolt 4. Next up in the news, Epic made major waves this week with its announcement of Unreal Engine 5, including the unveiling of several new graphics approaches to increasing our favorite buzzword, fidelity of game graphics. Epic showcased a tech demo running on PlayStation 5 hardware, probably a dev kit, and the reveal and subsequent headlines were replete with sensationalism on how our PCs are now being put to shame by consoles, and included the liberal use of the phrase next gen, which we suppose is right about on time. All of that said, it sort of deserves it. The Unreal Engine 5 demo was impressive. The tech demo, titled Lumen in the Land of Nanite, highlights a few things that Unreal Engine 5 will bring with it. The demo gets its namesake from the core technology in UE5, Nanite Virtualized Geometry. The idea behind Nanite is that developers can port film-quality assets into UE5 with automatic scalability in terms of LOD depending on the scene. Quote, Nanite virtualized micro-polygon geometry frees artists to create as much geometric detail as the eye can see. Nanite virtualized geometry means that film-quality source art comprising hundreds of millions or billions of polygons can be imported directly into Unreal Engine. Anything from ZBrush sculpts to photogrammetry scans to CAD data, it just works. We've heard that line somewhere before, but Jensen, is that you? Is Jensen haunting the studio again? Either way, there's also Lumen System, which Epic says is, quote, a fully dynamic global illumination solution that immediately reacts to scene and light changes. Epic frames this as a way around the static lighting limitations found in current game engines. Epic claims that developers will no longer need to develop light maps by hand or wait for, quote, light map bakes to finish and to author light map UVs. Additionally, the idea of streaming assets from storage to system memory is apparently being realized thanks to SSDs finally making their way into consoles. It's not a new idea, mind you, it's just one that's been shelved thanks to spinning storage. With SSDs, increased memory, and improved I/O of new consoles, games should be able to theoretically load in assets as the scene is rendered. This obviously has big implications for loading screens and for pop-in with models. On the business side, Epic is transitioning UE5 to a new model where royalties are waived until a game reaches $1 million in gross revenue. Epic Games CEO Tim Sweeney also noted in the company's Unreal Engine 5 press briefing that he believes there's going to be a knock-on impact from the Sony PlayStation 5's SSD implementation specifically that could impact PCs as well. We've already known that the PlayStation 5 and Xbox are both moving to solid-state storage. This has been known for a long time now, but Sweeney seems to indicate it's more of an architectural advancement in the PlayStation 5's storage solution than just the SSD alone. Sweeney seemed to imply that the new SSDs would be sufficiently fast to render game worlds tens of gigabytes in size, direct quote, on the fly, highlighting that it's specifically the PlayStation 5's storage architecture that outpaces what PCs are currently capable of. Sweeney specifically stated that it's, quote, ahead of anything you can buy on PC for any amount of money right now. And if there's one man who knows about being able to buy things with large amounts of money, that's probably the guy. It's going to help drive future PCs, Sweeney said, further elaborating that SSDs need to catch up to the PS5 storage solution on PC. Note that Sweeney, despite being a CEO of a massive company at this point, is extremely technically competent. He's not like a lot of the tech CEOs out there, and likely knows what he's talking about here. So this isn't just CEO speak of trying to get the partners to like them more. It's probably not just a fluff piece, and historically, Sweeney's been a PC advocate first in the past. Samsung, 6.5 gigabyte per second read PCIe Gen 4 SSDs announced. Samsung just announced its new PCIe Gen 4 SSD, the PM9A3, the highlight of which is among chart-topping sequential read performance at 6,500 megabytes per second. Some of the other stats aren't as impressive, particularly the random write speed at 180,000 IOPS. This drive seems to be optimized specifically for high sequential reads, which would make it useful in data center deployments or other targeted use cases where that's the primary need. The SSD also writes at 3,500 megabytes per second sequentially, putting it among top performers, but barring it from being the top performer, or among the very top few. Random read IOPS is reported as 900,000 for this one, according to Samsung's marketing materials. Samsung intends to make a full range of the PM9A3, starting at 960 gigabytes and reaching almost 8 terabytes at 7.68 terabytes for the largest model after over-provisioning. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, go to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of our new mouse mats. They are up there and shipping now as the orders come in. It's about, as stated, 36 by 12 or so in freedom units, in inches, and we've got them available. So thanks for your support. We'll see you all next time.